I want to bring in now Chief Executive Officer of Cowrie Asset Management Limited, Mr. Johnson Chukwu. He joins us now from Lekki in Lagos. Thank you for joining us on the program today.
Thank you for having me. Good day.
And good to see you. First off, would you say it is unfair that the United States, unfair on the United States that Nigeria is imposing this import ban on 25 different product categories, if it is true that that is what the federal government has decided to do?
Well, I think the U.S. is just trying to whip up sentiment to support the position of Donald Trump on imposing a 14% tariff on import from Nigeria. There is no justification to compare Nigeria's restriction on importation of things like pork, meat, fruit juice, from not just U.S., from any other country, to the issues around tariff that the United States has imposed across the globe. So every country, particularly for small, weak or emerging economies, they have a compelling need for some level of protection because their industries are not developed, they are not yet competitive. So there must be a support for those industries to grow, to develop, to grow, and for those economies to grow, after which they will be in a better position to trade on even terms with more matured or more advanced economies. So it's given that where economies are still weak, that structures are put in place to stimulate development of that economy, which is why Nigeria had placed a ban on importation of things like pork, meat, vegetable, fruit juice, and the likes. So I think the U.S. is just making an issue to justify the imposition of tariff on imports across the world. So it's just not limited to Nigeria. So I don't think that's just, for me, a make-up excuse.
But do you think that this could harm U.S.-Nigeria trade?
Well, not much. Not much in the first place. If you look at Nigeria's exports of food and food-related items, which is what we basically say to America, other than oil, is account for less than 2% of total exports. But if you look at oil is excluded from the list of items that the U.S. is imposing duties on. So which means oil will still flow at the same rate it was going to the U.S. So that will not be affected. If you look at Nigeria's import from the U.S., Nigeria's total import from U.S. account for about 6.36% of total import. In the last quarter of last year, it was about 1 trillion naira import from the U.S. And these are basically vehicles. And Nigeria is not about increasing the tariff on those items it import from U.S. So I think on the balance, trade flow between Nigeria and U.S. will remain relatively at the same level with marginal decline because of the tariff that we impose on those food items that we export to the U.S. But also, I want to mention this. Nigerian food items exported to the U.S. are largely consumed by Nigerians in the U.S. who are homesick, who have the palate, their Nigerian palate exported to U.S. and they want to eat our food. So even as the price of those items are going to increase, you will realize that Nigerians in U.S. will still order for vegetable, will still order for the food items that are exported from Nigeria to the U.S. I don't think that it's just that it will erode their purchasing power or affect their savings. But I think average Nigerian who goes to U.S. that maintains their Nigerian palate will still want to eat Nigerian food.
If I know Nigerians, they will maintain their palates. So the Minister of Trade and Investment had said earlier that much of the impact of the U.S. tariff will be felt in the non-oil sector. You also alluded to that. That's a whole lot of businesses that will be impacted. And I'm looking at, when you talk about the non-oil sector, you're looking at maybe those who do fabrics and, all the likes of them. And then those who also produce food to send to Nigerians abroad.
Yes, those are the major items we export to the U.S. other than oil. Oil accounts for the greater part of what we export, but the other elements of export that are contained in what Nigeria shipped to U.S. are food and food-related items. You mentioned things like textiles. The textiles are basically Nigerians who are wearing homemade and Nigerian-made brocade or apparels, which Nigerians still want to wear over there. And like I said earlier, the same issue of attachment to their Nigerian roots will certainly, to a reasonable extent, neutralize the impact of the increase in the cost of those items. And bear in mind that the tariff that the U.S. is imposing on Nigeria is about 14%. So it then means that the price of these items will increase by 14%. So, and I think average Nigerians in the U.S. will still want to eat their Nigerian food. We still want to wear their aswebi for their wedding ceremonies. Yes, you might have a marginal decline because prices are going up, but I think it will not be that severe. As long as oil remains excluded. But if you bring in oil, if they decide to impose the same duties on oil import from Nigeria, then the trade between the two countries will be severely affected.
The Minister of Finance did say he was assuring that the National Economic Council will assess the impact of the 14% tariffs. But aren't we already past that, saying that the U.S. is responding to our own seeming retaliation?
Well, I wouldn't know what the Economic Council want to do. We have an average 27% duty on some items coming from the U.S. Most of it, the item that the U.S. Government has picked out in our earlier conversation, for me, are not the relevant issues. The other items we import from the U.S. are largely used vehicles. As long as there's no new duty, because if we impose additional duty on imported used vehicles, certainly it will affect our own economy in terms of, because we don't produce those vehicles. So I don't see Nigeria imposing that. But as it relates to the US duties, I do not imagine that we're going to have any major shift in our trade activities with the US. So whatever the council want to decide on, it certainly not be that they will take out duties on vehicle imports, because doing that will simply mean they're going to take out duties on vehicle imports across the globe, not just US. And if you take out vehicle duties from US, then you have to contend with dumping, because people used to, if you remember, Manachi, that we used to bring all sorts of Tokumba vehicles to the country, including the ones that are complete write-off, which these duties have to some extent constrained us from doing. So I don't know what they're going to end up with. But for me, what we need to do is to look inwards and see how we build a productive economy. We already have a population of over 220 million. So we have a relatively or potentially large consumer market. So if we develop our economy and become a productive economy, and we can sell locally, we have a huge market. If you look at when we used to do the ease of doing business, Global Competitiveness Index, our greatest score was always in the size of the market, but it remains a potential market. So instead of bending backward and say you're going to take out duties on import from the US, I think what we should do is develop a market and then have a robust market that will produce multiple products. In terms of our export, if you look at the countries we export to, US is not a major export partner today, even though they buy our oil. You have the likes of Netherlands, Spain, and India as our export destination. In terms of import, you have the likes of China, India, and those two countries from Asia account for more than 40% of our imports. So as a trading partner, US position has lost to some extent its vaulting position as Nigeria's trading partner. That does not mean we will dismiss them, but I don't think the decision would be to bend backward to remove duties on vehicles or to remove duties on items that we have banned from being imported into the country, like pork, like meat, like fruit juice, because we also want to nurture our own local economy. Bear in mind that the US has huge subsidy for agricultural production in their own economy. So if you take out the ban, you're going to have dumping of those products in Nigeria.
Yeah, I'll tell you one country that's not bending, whether backwards or forwards, and that's China, which is preparing its response to the U.S. tariffs, just waiting on Donald Trump to announce the 50% tariffs, and then they will retaliate. Trump thinks it's a bad idea for China to retaliate, and that's because he'll be also negotiating with the South Korean president, who said they're not going China's route. How do you think the U.S.-China standoff will end?
Well, I think however it will end, U.S. will be the worst of. I guess that the reality will hit home. The U.S. government, the Donald Trump government will realize that the folly of taking on the whole world. You don't start a war and take on the whole world. There is no economic model that says a country should pick up warriors across the world. And then China is no longer a pushover that they thought it was or used to be. China is the second largest economy today. China is a major export economy. Like I said earlier, China accounts for more than almost a quarter of our total imports. And that applies to almost every country in Africa. So the African market is there. China is intensively developing the African market. China is exporting to the entire Europe. That China is exporting to Asia, other Asian countries. So the US trying to force China by saying they will limit Chinese export to the US. China has alternative markets, and China has a comparative production advantage over the US. So US will hurt its economy more than it will hurt the Chinese economy. Of course, Chinese economy will suffer to some extent because I think China's trade surplus against US over 12 trillion dollars. But be that as it may, China has alternative markets, and the US is not a cost-efficient producer today. So the US imposing this tariff on China will mean that a lot of commodities that are consumed in the US will land in the US at exorbitant prices. And the US market will either try to produce those things and they will not produce at the cost that the Chinese can produce them. So the US citizen will be the worse off for it because they're going to pay for those products at prices that ordinarily are higher than what they should have bought them if they were coming from China. What would that lead to? It will lead to an increase in inflation rate. It will worsen the standard of living of Americans, and it could lead to some level of social dislocation. We are seeing demonstrations across the 50 states of the US, and the impact has not actually hit home. It hasn't hit home run. We've not seen the effect on inflation. We've not seen the effect on erosion of household consumer purchasing power. We've not seen the impact on declining standard of living, and this will eventually all happen. So I think on a balance, the US, this will affect both countries, no doubt, but the US will be worse off for it.
I've heard, some analysts say that Trump's actions are reminiscent of the same factors that led to the 1929 stock market crash and the recession that followed after. What do you think?
Well, the expectation are there's a study now that people are trying to link the 1929 capital market crash to tariff impositions by the US and global tariff impositions. But I think it's beyond that, but it was a contributory factor because when you impose tariffs, you basically vitiate the concept of competitive advantage, where countries produce what they can produce more efficiently and export what they can produce efficiently and import what they cannot produce efficiently. So you are going to see a slowdown. You see a slowdown in trade. A slowdown in trade will lead to a slowdown in manufacturing. A slowdown in manufacturing will lead to a slowdown in employment, a slowdown in household income, and sell-off of assets. And that is a chain of events that this kind of policy decision that Trump has started could lead to. And that's why people are making that analogous comparison and alluding that the 1929 capital market crash or stock market crash was as a result of tariff imposition. I think it goes beyond that, but it may have been a contributory factor or a factor that worsened it. In fact, actually, it was a factor that worsened the situation and contributed to a recession, but it wasn't the fact that what triggered the stock market crash. Stock market crash happened, and duties as part of remedial measures were imposed, and those duties worsened the recovery process.
Right. So you earlier mentioned, what the U.S. final consumers could expect. What about here in Nigeria? How will the current global economic realities trickle down to everyday people?
Well, a couple of things will happen. We've seen oil price drop as low as $64 per barrel. Bear in mind that our budget was predicated on $75 per barrel. We saw Naira giving within the past few days from about 1,533 to about 1,620 or 30 at the official window. So an increase in exchange rate will lead to an increase in inflation rate, which will weaken household purchasing power and weaken household consumption, and therefore weaken standard of living of average households. That's one aspect. Then at the macro level, we're going to see a decline in our reserve and a decline in our federal government income, which will mean that the federal government has to borrow more if it has to meet its obligations or commitment in the federal government budget, and that will also apply to virtually all arms of government. So if that happens, you're going to see an increase in national debt and an increase in debt service and inability of government to meet some of its budgeted expenditure, particularly those ones that are not discretionary, non-discretionary, those things like capital expenditure budget, which will slow down economic development if the government cannot implement capital budget.
Indeed. Thank you so much, Johnson Chukwu. I always appreciate, your analysis on these issues. And I know that, in the coming days, we'll be looking to you for some more analysis.
Thank you for having me.